name is Stacey Pyett. I am a program manager at Wageningen University and Research. We are an academic organization located in the Netherlands. And my job is really focused on our protein work, keeping track of what we're doing and engaging with shareholders, stakeholders who are interested in our work in this domain. So today I'm just going to walk you through some of the main topics that we observe are challenges in plant-based dairy. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce you a little bit more to the context of the work we do related to proteins broadly. So it's a major topic for our organization. It was one of three key pillars of our strategy that we brought out in 2019. So it's a topic that is widely shared across the organization. And we developed some themes that we share across the organization that we consider important. We have three science themes, which you'll see along the left-hand side of my slide. Protein functionality is one, biochemistry is one, and what we call the complex transition network is the other. So these are domains where we feel like there's a need for developing the science further. And then we have three societal pillars, which are basically the sort of impact areas where we want to work to create a change. One, efficient production and use of proteins. Two, providing more and better proteins. And three, at the interface of food and society, how do we interact? How do we share our food? And where each of these intersect, we have a different sort of working zone and a different kind of goal for our organization of what we want to achieve. And today I'm going to focus on the ones that I think are most relevant and interesting for you. So we'll talk a little bit about the more and better proteins, where that meets protein functionality, some of the work that we're doing to improve plant sources, and then where that meets biochemistry, we'll talk about some of the microbial sources and the developments there. And then at the interface of protein functionality and food and society, we're talking about how we can address the functionality gaps, both from a flavor perspective as well as from a product perspective in some of these sources. I just wanted to let you know that we're working on more domains. Maybe some of you are interested more in the nutritional or digestion perspective. But there's not a lot of time today to go through all of these, but you're welcome to contact me should you want to talk more about some of these other topics. So let's start with the kind of more and better proteins and talk about some of the new source categories that we think are very interesting and that we're tracking. Number one, and one I guess is probably familiar to many of you, is pulses. This is kind of a hot topic in Europe, although I know it's also a hot topic in parts of North America and Canada and India. So it's really kind of a hot topic all over the world. And I think what many countries are looking for, and the reason they're choosing plant-based, pulse-based proteins, is looking for locally produced sources that will provide adequate nutrition and some texture for our plant-based foods, alternatives to soy. Basically, they're a good choice for cultivation in Europe based on their relatively high yields, and they're generally accepted by consumers. We all know what a chickpea is, and that's pretty comfortable for us as a food source. But the downside of the pulse proteins, they're all basically storage proteins, which kind of limits their functionality in terms of gelling, binding, water holding, solubility, etc. So we're also interested in looking at proteins which can get a little bit closer to the egg and dairy proteins in terms of their functional performance. And for us, an interesting category of proteins that have the potential to do that are agricultural side streams, in particular, proteins from green leaves. That's a picture of sugar beets there. Some of those have really excellent gelling capacity, and potato proteins, another example, an ability to be soluble and remain soluble at pretty acid pHs. And last but not least, when we look at whether we can get a truly low cost source of proteins into the future that we can compete with soy on price, our answer for that is looking at fermentative biomass. So that's basically growing microbes and using the microbial biomass, or basically their bodies, as a source of protein. And if we were to just sort of dive into that last one a little bit, around fermentative biomass, there are multiple ways that we can use fermentation and use microbes to produce protein. So microbial biomass is the one that we are very interested in because we think it has the potential to sort of move the bar on cost. But we're also interested in what we call fermentative ingredients, so growing microbes for alternative and flavor components, alternative ingredients to the protein. And then last but not least, an interesting area of development related to fermentative biomass is actually using the fermentative microbe to create what we call recombinant proteins, which are proteins that are expressed. So we're not talking about the bacterial itself, but something that the bacteria expresses. And using genetic modification, it's possible to create recombinant proteins that are animal identical. That has some challenges in upscaling. It's still a pretty expensive technology to be applied for food, although I will say that recombinant proteins is probably easier than cultured meat, and we know that cultured meat is getting a lot of attention, so why not this? Benefits, microbial biomass can be grown on really low value waste streams, a lot of high carbohydrate materials, really things that we're not otherwise using. They can be integrated into energy food production systems, like the picture that I included there. That's an example of a mycoprotein, a yeast-based protein integrated process with bioethanol refinery. And there are already some bacterial strains that are approved for use in food. So even in terms of food regulatory, it's actually more accessible than a lot of people think. So switching gears, if we look at another big challenge for plant-based dairy, it's really about off flavors. Off flavors are an even bigger challenge in dairy alternatives than in meat analogs, basically due to the lower viscosity and higher water content, also combined with the way the dairy products are breaking down in the mouth, we get a higher release of these off flavors. And that the general expectation that dairy is a pretty clean tasting flavor substrate. There are multiple ways that off flavors get into our products. So in some cases, we're getting quote unquote off flavors, which are actually just the natural sort of flavor of the plant that we've derived our protein from. You might get green, earthy, or hay-like aromas. For example, just the taste of a pea, which is delicious when it's in a pea, but it's not what we expect from yogurt. So it becomes something we characterize as a kind of off flavor. You might also get process-generated off notes like beanie or cardboard. Those are typical flavors or typical descriptions that we would use for oxidative off flavors, which come from protein processing when we're drying our protein powder, for example. Depending on where our off flavors are coming from, there are different solutions to how we can improve our product or reduce the presence of those off flavors. In some cases, when the off flavor is coming from the plant itself, then cultivar selection or actually plant breeding can play a role in helping us reduce the number of off flavors that are present or the severity of those off flavors. Another one can be prevention by process adaptation, especially if we're getting process-generated off notes. There are ways that we can look into the heat load or the oxidative stress that we're putting on the protein material to reduce formation of those flavors. After that, if they're in there in the primary processing and we've got ourselves a kind of a protein powder, then we have to soak, heat, extract, or ferment away those flavors. Those are all possible, but less powerful. The further we get along the supply chain, the less powerful our solutions are. And finally, as a kind of last worst case scenario, we can look into masking, which is actually adding a flavor that will, prevent perception of that other off flavor that's there. That tends to be an expensive and also not terribly powerful solution, if you will. So I would again recommend that be a kind of last resort. And just to give you an example of some of the work that we are doing in this direction, this is a picture from a consortium that we're running where we're looking at breeding peas and fava beans specifically for clean flavors in the food application, so in the plant-based food. It's not just about breeding a clean tasting fava bean because the fava bean can taste clean, but have some kind of precursor that might create an off flavor at the end of the pipe. So actually we're breeding plants and then we're testing them at the end in sort of model dairy products, model meat analogs, and then going back to the beginning of the pipe and thinking about how we're breeding, giving back some feedback, and continuing in that loop to optimize for the end application. It's a long process. Breeding anything costs us 4 to 6 years anyway, and when we add in the complexity of food processing, it's an ambitious goal. Okay, finally, the last example that I'm going to take you through is talking about the last but not least kind of challenge in dairy alternatives is about structuring and cleaner labels. If you pick up a dairy alternative in the store, it's likely that you can observe that they're actually not protein gels just by looking at the labels. Most of them have starch or polysaccharides that are present that are actually doing the work of giving this product its texture. There's a reason for that. The currently available plant proteins tend to be less soluble and less functional than dairy proteins. Most of them have trouble forming gels, especially by the time they've been sort of pre-processed into a protein powder. The gelation capacity is lost really in that process where we're giving them a very high heat load, we're changing their pH, we're precipitating many of them, we're spray drying many of them. So it's very hard by the time you get that protein powder to be able to create a gel from that protein itself. So to develop truly functional plant proteins, we need to take a supply chain approach and include that sort of early stage processing as well. Our approach includes looking for milder primary processing, so understanding how we can give the protein the least damage, then understanding the synergies between plant protein sources. So oftentimes we see that a single protein is not sufficient to create a gel network, but we believe that smart combinations can do the job. And last but not least, understanding the interactions between plant proteins and other components and how we can, for example, use the fiber that's naturally present in plants as a sort of co-gelling agent to create a plant-based gel. So this is an example of a project that we've, well, some work that we've done in a previous project and some work that we are starting up now. So we have looked into synergies between proteins, although this example that I have for you that can be publicly shared is actually between a dairy protein and soy protein. And the example here is, when we just toss them together, when we just put sodium caseinate and soy protein together, and we give them no sort of specific heat treatment, they really become enemies of each other, and we end up with a quite sort of soft gel that is actually a lot less good than a 10% sodium caseinate gel. But when we start tinkering with how we treat them together, we can create a wide variety of different textures and a wide variety of different microstructures. So basically, we're putting them together, we're heating them together at different pHs, and we're looking at what we get as a sort of gel after we gel those two proteins together. And we found out that, once we optimize that, we can actually get to a gel which is even better, even stronger than the original sodium caseinate gel. And we have reason to believe that this is also true for plant proteins, that we can actually create even stronger gels when we do smart mixing and pre-processing of proteins together. And we are kicking off a consortium to look into this, hopefully in about 4 weeks from now. So those were 3 examples that I picked out that I thought would be interesting for you. And I just wanted to loop back to what we believe we're working toward. So Europe in 2050 and how we hope it looks. We believe there's a lot more we can do with our aquatic resources, so including looking at oceanic farms and what protein sources we can find from water resources. On the land, we expect to see more integrated pulse and grain production. So in Europe, that means a lot more cultivation of pulses, because right now, most of our agriculture in terms of protein production is looking at grain or animal sources. We hope that we get to a position where we're eating about 1/3 of our protein from animal sources and about 2/3 from plant-based sources. So good that you are all here working on plant-based dairy alternatives to help us get there. And last but not least, we find it really important that we're working on a circular food system where we're reducing our waste and we're keeping our protein in the protein system by upcycling lost and wasted protein sources. So I think I went through a lot in the last 15 minutes, and I would appreciate if you have any questions for me or other things you want to discuss.